Welcome to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where Peter Madison and David Shurock discuss the complexities of adopting new ways of working at scale. Hello, Dave. How are you today?
Excellent, Peter. Good to see you again. So, what's new in your world?
Oh, well, a ton of things. I've been playing around with AI. It's a game and in all sorts of different ways, and having a bunch of fun and some not so fun as it seems to run into problems that are fairly well-known problems that it should have been able to solve and then not being able to. But there's things like that are interesting, and I know that your AI meetup that you have where you live, you had a very interesting presentation last week about what I would call AI autonomy, and I'm curious. Do you think, because I've described to you the problem I was having with OAuth and the agents just going in circles, not being able to figure this out, do you think that if I'd given the AI more autonomy, it would have been able to solve my problem?
It would have solved it in some way or other. Yes. Would it not? I mean, it depends how you articulate the problem, I think. But yeah, the AI discussion that you were talking about, Callum, my son, came in and spoke a bit about the work he's doing at Andon Lab. We've had Callum on as a guest before, and he's doing this work around evals and safety. And we were just learning a little bit about how they structure problems. And we've talked on these conversations a lot about context and agents and creating various how to go about understanding how to implement AI in a business process or a business environment. And I think one of the key takeaways that a lot of the audience stepped away from this conversation last week was that, let's say in Silicon Valley, or at least in certain places, they're not they're not trying to constrain the problem. They're taking this sort of AlphaGo approach, which is go learn how to do this problem as best you can, and then letting the LLMs steer. So to your point about the OAuth problem, if you give that OAuth problem over and it's articulated well and then get out of the way, then the LLM will come back with a solution, not necessarily the one you're looking for or the one that you can explain, but a solution.
So in this case, and I think the key part of this is the articulated well, and the piece that Andon Labs is playing with there is this idea that, I mean, we've talked about this for years, this idea, well, if you've got a good understanding of what the objective is and you can make it measurable and you can then say, hey, go after that, then you're setting a direction, you're giving it a place to go and then saying, okay, go do that, make your decisions, right? Now you can start to make decisions towards that target. And as long as your decisions are moving you towards that target and that's the right measure and it's the right direction, then you should be successful in whatever that objective is.
Well, if it's relative, like say a complicated problem, right? So if I'm taking a set of accounts and trying to reconcile, what's happening on those sets of accounts, the rules there are relatively straightforward and can be defined pretty cleanly to go and figure out mathematically what's going on in those accounts. It's much harder, I think, in sort of real world context. If you take customer support, for example, what's the definition of a satisfied support call, right? And there's the call was only this long, this customer left and had their problem resolved and so on. But there are lots of nuances there about were they satisfied with how the problem was solved? And did it satisfy the problem long term, or was it a short term thing?
Well, this brings you into it. It's Big Hero 6, are you satisfied with your care? The conceptual idea of well, you can ask, you look for the afterwards, like sort of, did you get what you were looking for from this conversation? I mean, with AI, we can of course start to look for like sentiment. What was the tone in the conversation? Did the tone change during the conversation? There's all sorts of things you can start to look for from those particular sets of conversations. But to your point, it's not cut and dried. I don't just have a number and say, hey, go solve for this number.
Well, and I think that's where. So again, I'm not speaking for Andon Labs when I look at this, but some of the feedback or what I was understanding is that the if I'm taking, for example, a cafe, and the key metric is you should make money over the long, a cafe experiment might be they're trying to simplify the environment so they can get data that they can see how the system is going to perform and change. Completely makes sense. You're controlling as many variables. In a business context, those variables grow and grow, and you end up in these really complex, nuanced relationships that you have with customers, partners, whatever it might be. And those problems become a lot harder to articulate in a way that there's a simple reward function.
Right, exactly. And so one of the pieces that you were talking about that people were finding surprising was the idea that they would essentially characterize it as giving the agent free rein.
Yeah, and you mean with guardrails and
Mhm.
governance constraints and things like this. And a lot of the conversation that we've had is around creating that context and locking it down and spending time articulating, clearly defining what is important in the context of the problem that they're trying to solve. Now, the AlphaGo model, the kind of sort of foundational idea behind a lot of the work that was being discussed is around, instead of sitting down and explaining through context what the rules are and what the best plays are, it's much more defining the clear kind of boundaries of what the rules are. Like, you've got to stay on the board and there's only so many moves that you can do. So those are hard constraints. But then letting the LLM actually figure out what strategy looks like in that. And by doing that, they're losing a lot of games in the early stages because they're trying things and they fail. They're trying things and they fail. But through that, they're beginning to learn the things that they try and don't fail, and then beginning to develop their own interpretation of how to work. And that's exactly what Callum was talking about in these cafes and vending machine examples, where initially there's this massive drop in, they lose a lot of money at the beginning because these tries fail more often than they succeed. But in the long run, they seem to be turning the corner and beginning to get better and better at whatever it is to do.
So there's a learning from the prior runs essentially. Then so they are feeding in what happened before and saying, okay, this is what you tried last time. This succeeded. This failed. These are the things that looked good out of that, and then they're feeding that in to be guidance for the next iteration of, hey, here's another $1,000. See if you do any better this time.
Well, but what's interesting, as you're describing that, I'm just thinking of the Virginia Satir curve, right, of
Mm-hmm.
organization. And this is exactly, we've bumped into this 100 times, just in a different context, which is we want change in the organization, but we don't want it to cost anything. So we don't want that dip in productivity as people experiment and learn how to work in a different way of working. Basically, exactly what was being described in the conversation. And yet what we tend to do, and we've seen this in organizational change, I'm just sort of seeing that connection, which is we go in and say we're going to have to make a process change, and the desire is make it cost nothing at all. And so you end up defining every part of the process because somehow we're going to make this lift and shift and ta-da, it's going to be better, but we're not going to incur that learning cost of, we have an opportunity here to use this platform, this technology, this whatever it is that's new, in a way that's even better than the way we used to do it.
Which is far more disruptive to the organization and is far more likely to fail. And which is why
it's fragile,
the last
right?
thing in the world you want to do is build out the entire thing and then just move everybody there overnight. It's like our entire process changes on Monday. It'll be chaos. It always is.
And people get caught up, because there are individuals somewhere making decisions that affect lots and lots of people, and they don't have the knowledge and the experience and the particular situation that each of those other individuals are going to do. So how do you create these changes without the learning curve? Well, you don't. You need a learning curve.
Yeah, and you do small incremental changes. Yep. You don't do massive changes across the whole organization like that because it is incredibly disruptive. You need to introduce new things in small increments and learn and experiment and see where the problems are going to be and figure out how to do that. And which is the right way to go about these sorts of changes in organizations. It is interesting. I mean, what you're describing there with the agent learning from its prior iterations, it's basically becomes an improving. So it's learning and improving from the piece it learned. That reinforcement learning and those pieces is, I mean, it's not new. I mean, you've used that within machine learning for a very long time. I think some of the new pieces, allowing the agents to have those self-reinforcing loops, is good, and seeing where they end up with that is interesting in of itself. And I do think that there's a piece where there is something definitely within, especially within, like, as we're developing software, there's so many different variables, so many different ways you can go. There's a lot of the like the spec driven world would say, hey, define everything up front. That's not always appropriate for everything. And you are seeing, as the models get, and I use quotes for this, smarter, the will make fewer mistakes, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
The models are starting to respond to a less specced out description of it and being allowed more freedom to make decisions about how something gets implemented. There are still guardrails you need around that. You don't want your agents running off and doing crazy things, and solving things in unintended ways, or ways in which are potentially damaging to the system as a whole. So it's why even in Andon Labs example there, their $1,000 constraint is a very large constraint. They're not basically saying, here's my credit card and my bank account, go spend as whatever you want, just make me money. Right?
Yeah, that's for sure. I find it, and just as you're describing that, there's that whole, I still come back to many of the conversations we've had have been around looking at, and we keep talking about this optimization mindset. We look at it from an optimization lens. The opportunities that organizations are trying to prove AI ROI on are, I have a process, it could be more efficient. How can I use AI to make it more efficient? And I think that becomes a conversation around constraints and around defining context, so that you're effectively trying to ring fence this AI tool technology to make things quicker, faster, whatever it might be, better in some way. And we keep talking about, instead of the optimization, there's a lot more to look at. Like, how can you really rethink how your business operates in some way? And that one does feel like it's, okay, let's find some system or ecosystem that was simulation world, and let the LLM go and run it and see what it comes up with strategically, which is different to what our executive team, with all the experience we have and the knowledge we have, would come up with as a potential solution, and start looking at that sort of simulation. I don't think you want to put an LLM at the top of Ford and say, go figure out how to design cars going forward and sell cars and support and maintain and so on. But I think in a simulation side, you might well want to explore that, because there's a lot of industries ripe for a rethink.
So what if? And so here's a concept for you. You took something like the quarterly prospectus out of an organization, which describes the financial operating of an organization, and you use that to say, go build a digital twin of the structures and decision making and the ways that my organization makes money. And now within that, I'm going to deploy an agent into it and say, okay, if you were in charge, what decisions would you make?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that you start just with that, but yes, there's something there to be had about how do you, well, say digital marketing agency or some sort of, self-contained business model, and see how that would be done differently. I think it's quite an interesting one.
I think that'd be kind of a fun little experiment to run. Maybe I'll try that if I ever have a free weekend. But...
Yes, yeah, for sure. Now, what is it we take away from the conversation that we're having?
I think for me, there's two big pieces here around. One is the make sure that you're taking advantage of the capabilities that an LLM has in terms of thinking outside the box, understanding those capabilities more and taking advantage of it in the right places. I'm not, to your point, I'm not sure everybody does. And I think the others is one that we've talked about many times before, which is that whereas you can take a non-deterministic engine like an LLM and you can put it into an existing process and maybe use that, if you use it in the right way, to improve that existing process, some of the real value comes from taking a step back and saying, what if we did this in an entirely different way? What if we did something else entirely new that we could use as a way of disrupting how we do business today, but also potentially disrupting even our industry?
I think I'm leaning on the Satir curve piece that we talked about, which is, well, that I introduced in. But one of the things that's striking me in this conversation is the realization that, and I'm thinking of the graphs that were being shared last week in the conversation, which is basically that the performance of these LLMs is laughably poor at the beginning. And there's lots of these stories about what LLMs do when you say, go and run whatever it is. They go and make a whole bunch of daft decisions. But the interesting thing is there's a bottom to that curve. And then they start beginning to learn what their context is and how to make decisions. And that, to me, model is sort of that Satir curve of organizational change. And again, organizations, we've certainly seen that. They don't like incurring cost. They don't want to see a dip in performance as new skills are developed and used and learned and improved until those new skills lead to something effective.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things that they're probably doing there is how they manage the context windows of what gets fed back in, because what you don't want to be doing is feeding in the entire transcript. You need to be summarizing that. So how do you pull out the parts that are valuable to feed into the next iteration? And how do you then stop that overwhelming it and becoming unbearable? Because there's just too much information and there's a limited amount of context window that you can operate within. Sure. But that'll take us to another set of conversations. So with that, we'll wrap up there for this week. And as always, tell your friends, hit subscribe. And if you would like to reach out to us, you can do that. Definitely Maybe Agile. Feedback at definitelymaybeagile.com. That way around. Yeah, there you go.
Excellent. Until next time, Peter. Thanks again.
Thanks. You've been listening to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where your hosts, Peter Madison and David Sharrock, focus on the art and science of digital, agile, and DevOps at scale.